Our first presenter is Jalen Parks, a second-year Master of Divinity candidate at Yale Divinity School, whose studies sit at the interstices of theological ethics, law, and abolition. Jalen's presentation is titled Animacies and Animisms, Poetic Reflections on Lifelines. So welcome, Jalen.
Thank you so much. Because we only have 10 minutes, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Animacies and Animisms, Poetic Reflections on Lifelines. Were rarely perceived as a kind of ape. It was more commonly suggested that Africans and apes shared libidinous sexual characteristics or were sexually linked. For the English, sex was barbaric, as the body was host to sin, and when they did not perceive Africans as a worldview, they evaluated them negatively, end quote. Metanoia. Metanoia from the Greek meaning meta, meaning after. After what? After me, after you, after them, after us, after black end, after black and blue, after dog, after God, after. Metanoia from the Greek nous, meaning thought. Thought, I thought I saw, I thought I think. Does the tree think it must, but think it can't? Metanoia from the Greek meta, meaning beyond that thought, beyond human, beyond gay, beyond sex, beyond what thought, that human thought. Metanoia from the Greek nous, meaning mind, what don't you mind? Metanoia from the Greek meta, meaning beyond, from the Greek nous, meaning mind. Metanoia, beyond thought, afterthought. Zakiya Amon Jackson describes the Black body's fleshiness and how it was aligned with animals as opposed to the Christian English mind, body, and spirit in the opening quotation. Jackson is detailing the first colonial encounters between Africans and English colonizers on the continent of Africa. In this quote from Jackson, we begin to see how the Christian non-imagination has created ecologies in which certain bodies and life forms are subordinated. In contrast, others are exalted as the idea of lifeliness. Many of these ecologies have been promulgated and concretized based upon bastardized readings and interpretations of Christian scripture that only serve those who have wielded the most power and created the most violence. These reflections seek to present an alternative to centuries-old epistemologies and epistemological values. The question guiding this inquiry is this: what might natural theology and animism mean for sexuality? In other words, what this inquiry aims to do is lay the foundation for crafting a fleshy sexual ethic. This project is an attempt to disrupt traditional theoethical discourse on sexuality by jettisoning appeals to humanity, insofar as these appeals create a human-animal dichotomy and hierarchy in which humans are the dominant and ideal sentient beings, animals are abject and less than ideal, and those human beings who are marked by Blackness are demonized as animals or worse. Because this work spans many fields and bucks against normative notions within theology, what it will require on the part of the theologian, the reader, and anyone who wishes to take it seriously is a type of metanoia. Metanoia that is not so much a repentance, but a radical change of mind. Animality. I once just was. I was not ape. I was not orangutan. I was not nigger, nigra, negro. I was not African. I was not monkey. I was not coon. I once just was. Then Obruni descended upon me and I became. And then Tubob descended upon me. And then Oyimbo descended upon me. And then White descended upon me and I became. I was called animal. I was called slave. I was called chattel. I was called property. I was called abomination. And then I became what I always was, that which I forget but try to remember, an animal. Animality is inextricably tied to race, especially in the United States context. From the earliest encounters between Africans and English colonizers, animality has been used to place persons outside of normative constructions of gender and sexuality in positions of subjugation. From the earliest formalized constructions of the human in Christian Europe, gender and sexuality have been used as indicators of being civilized. Thus, it is not possible to discuss racialized animality without also discussing gender and sexuality. Somewhat needless to say, this is an issue because animality has been viewed as an issue. According to Graham Harvey, in Western discourse, animality is problematic insofar as it represents primitiveness, non-culture, barbarism, worldliness, and lack of spirituality. This becomes especially important in the conversation concerning Black people and animality when we consider the earliest conceptions of racial difference had very little to do with skin color and everything to do with notions of civility, such as the ones considered to be lacking in animals. The primary link in the early interactions between Christian English colonizers and Africans was that African peoples walked about the land naked. This nudity communicated not only sexual promiscuity, but by extension, a lack of spiritual discipline and moral compass. These notions are further compounded by Western science's distinction between personhood and just being alive. According to Western science, humanity is marked by self-consciousness and communication. Thus, humans are alive, but they are also talkative. When Europeans first encountered them, Africans were naked and spoke in unknown languages to the colonizers that had invaded their land. They, being Africans, also behaved in ways that were foreign to those who had no experience with cultures outside of those touched by the hegemony of Europe. Taken with the fact that Africans were in proximity to animals such as apes and chimpanzees, a comparison to such states of being was readily available for the European colonizers to make sense of what they were experiencing. While this partially explains the connection between what eventually becomes Blackness and animality, it does not offer a complete picture. Animacy. Though it is important to understand the historical beginnings of racialized animality, the picture is not in full focus without discussing language and meaning. Within the field of cognitive linguistics, there exists a concept known as animacy. For linguists, animacy is the quality of liveliness, sentience, or humanness of a noun or a noun phrase with grammatical and syntactic consequences. Those who have undertaken the study of linguistics have found that in many languages, there exists an animacy hierarchy that dictates the aliveness and humanness of an entity or being linguistically. Within these hierarchies, linguists found that if a certain entity behaved in particular ways, then those entities below its level of animacy could not conduct themselves syntactically as though they were more animate. In other words, according to the rules of hierarchy within animacies, even if biologically two entities are the same, if one is accorded less animacy, then it is impossible for it to behave in more animate ways. This was found to be the case in a cross-study completed of several languages, including English. Here, one can begin to see how languages can and or will conspire to cement racialized animality conceptions as natural to certain persons and beings. Animacy hierarchies tend to privilege the human adult male who is free as opposed to enslaved and communicative as the most animate being. Simultaneously, everyone or thing else falls below its level of animacy and thus cannot behave in equal or more animate ways. It is important to note that animacy and its hierarchies are not a monolith. However, this example is useful to illustrate the linguistic nature of a social phenomenon. It is important to discuss both the social phenomenon of racialized animality and animacy in concert because both have grave implications for the quote unquote other. The negative associations in racialized animality are reinforced through animacy hierarchies, while animacy hierarchies are reproduced through social phenomenon. Animacy hierarchies are oriented toward the human, and thus any entity that occupies a position below the human is considered non-ideal. Humans occupy this position because they are communicative or conscious subjects that have the ability to be self-possessed and self-determined, not leaving things up to fate. In being self-determined and self-possessed in ways that differ from the non-human, humans also receive the ability to object render or make objects out of other beings. In object rendering, the human also has the ability to name what is desirable and what makes other beings non-human. When this ability collides with capitalist acquisition, this is where one begins to see the dehumanization of others vis-a-vis objectification of other beings that might otherwise be considered human. In this objectification, the subject has become the object and encounters dispossession of humanist self-determination, self-definition, and agency. This was and is the project of colonialism. In colonialist interactions, which is also to say capitalist interactions, the condition that allows one to undergo objectification is a general lack of philosophical or moral awareness. More specifically, in the colonialist interactions detailed earlier in this section, the Africans' perceived sexual promiscuity and nudity led to their perception as lacking legible philosophical values, which consequently placed them lower on the animacy scale or hierarchy. It was partially coincidental that Africans lived proximate to apes and chimpanzees, who English colonizers read them as relating to. Grammars of gender. Throughout this paper, a plethora of fields have been perused, from linguistics to theology and animisms. There are respective grammars within each of these fields that dictate how particular topics or subjects are spoken about. The difficulty in a project such as the one undertaken here is that it must traverse each of these grammars in a way that makes sense when it is placed in conversation with the grammars before and the grammars after. These grammars also have implications for the interventions that can or cannot be made in the issues at hand. Such is the case, especially for the fields that have been heretofore discussed. In each of these grammars, we have seen how hierarchies have played a prominent role in how they, or the fields, interact with a broader range of materials and concepts. In animism, hierarchies are based upon sentience and Western conceptions of consciousness, that in turn has led to anthropocentricity that values self-possessed and determined individuals over those that are not. This hierarchy naturally interacts with animacy hierarchies. A few are oriented positively toward adult human males that are free, and everything else is placed in a lower position depending on a combination of markers concerning animation. The last, taken together, picture has been painted how it can be the case that certain people have been associated negatively with animality, which has led to their subjugation and objectification. Implicitly at stake in each of these discussions has been sexuality, namely how the body is read as animate or inanimate, self-possessed or dispossessed, clothed or naked. Another way to read these hierarchical binaries are as genders, whereby one gender is ideal and the other not. This is also to say that these binary hierarchies, while portrayed as fixed, are not and are slippery. This is also to suggest that we must also find new ways of speaking, new grammars. To think new grammars in this context, it is helpful to use thinkers such as Hortense Spillers and M. Norbezi Phillip. In her seminal article, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, Spillers introduces the concept of ungendering. For Spillers, ungendering was the result of the Middle Passage, whereby slaves lost gender or were ungendered due to slavery's dispossession. In detailing the ungendering of Black female slaves specifically and the continued social marginalization of Black people as a result of exclusion from what I am calling the rights of humanity, Spillers also highlights the radical potential of claiming the monstrosity. Thus, this project's intervention calls for an ungendering of these hierarchies and embrace of the resulting monstrosity. In other words, though ungendering was a violent process for those who were taken as captives through the Middle Passage, what possibilities might be opened up if we ungendered that which is oppressive and serves to objectify? It may just open up new ways of relating. If we were to lose gendered hierarchies such as animacy and inanimacy, self-possession or dispossession, clothed or naked, we might find deeper ways of relating and being in the world rather than possessing the world. Part of what has been discussed in this project itself is ungendering. It has brought together different fields that use varying grammars to discuss similar, if not the same, topics. It has intentionally mixed up the grammars of animacy, animism, critical theory, theopoetics, and theology to stake a new claim. This is a sort of undoing and ungendering. What is also instructive in this kind of work is M. Norbezi Phillip's Zong. In Zong, Phillip abstracts the text of a trial concerning a slave ship, captive Africans, and the ship's captain. Phillip abstracts the text until meaning is lost, dislodged, convoluted, and some other meaning is gleaned. The reception of meaning is not dictated or guided by Phillip, but rather it is open for the individual reader or community that approaches the text. This can be a model for the way that we approach ungendering our grammars, especially concerning racialized animality. Animality is not bad, but it has been made bad due to the gendered hierarchies that have been attached to it. This does not have to be the case. It is up to us whether we will continue to accept such hierarchies or ungender them until they are abstracted, such that the new life and new meaning might be found.
Thank you so much, Jalen, for that really rich presentation. I have a question I can follow up with, but I'd like to open it to those in the Zoom room. If you have a question, you can put it in the chat or please ask it. We might have to cut some of these Q&A sessions shorter just because of how quick the turnaround is. But I guess, so if no one has a burning question, I'm struck in the beginning of Jalen, your presentation of the kind of incantational way that you read your work. And I'm wondering how incantation can help us rework some of these linguistic hierarchies that you're talking about, or even kind of help us reform and reimagine our own imaginations.
Thank you for that question, Claire. It's an interesting question because in Zong, M. Nurbezi Philip, as I said, abstracts the text of a legal case, such that when you read it, there are only letters, but there are no full words. And so if you read it aloud, it almost sounds like you're aspirating water or like you are struggling to breathe in such a way that kind of makes you imagine what the experience of the enslaved Africans on that ship might have been. And so I think to get to your question, in incantations, I think that we are able to channel a type of relating that allows us to work more diligently to do the ungendering type of work that we have to do when it comes to hierarchies, especially that relate to positioning certain beings above others in ways that lead to their subjugation and annihilation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that was a really powerful answer. Thank you. Does anyone else have a question in our Zoom? Yes, please, Noah.
Great presentation. I really like all of it. Just like it was just so amazingly done. One like question that I have is, how do you see more so with like the recent like rise of anti-Asian attacks and anti-Semitic attacks as well, like too. Whereas how can we fight back against these terms of animism against other communities as
well? Thank you for that, Noah. So I think that in my research, some of the earliest kind of linkages between these type of animalizations of certain communities start at the project of colonization and the transatlantic slave trade. And so I think by talking through that, we are also talking about animalization more broadly that touches communities such as Asian communities and Jewish communities. And so even though I am using enslaved Africans and that moment of colonization as the lens through which to view this, it's not so much to cut off talking about other communities, but it is rather a way to give us a starting place so that we can then also apply this in some way to broader communities. And so I don't look at this as, though I'm using this specific, moment in history, I don't look at it as only speaking to the ways that we don't animalize or don't animalize Black people, but animalization more broadly as a concept and the ways that it touches non-Black marginalized folks as well.